Could I say thank you very much, Kathleen, for that extraordinary presentation, I've never, it's a long time since I heard such a mellifluous manifesto. Now, I've been asked to tell you before the question and answer session that Kathleen's paper will be available on the TASC website tomorrow, so that's something that I think we can all look forward to. Now, I believe there is one microphone, a roving microphone, and I will take questions in the order which they're posed. There's a gentleman.
Thank you very much. My name is Sean O'Hegarty. I used to be director of the NESF up to recently. Thank you very much for your paper, Kathleen. I think what you have said would command broad support across society. But when it comes to the political parties, I find it very disturbing, and I'm going to be deliberately provocative here by stating that all political parties in this country have moved to the right. It's striking that over the last several months, the debate in the Oireachtas, the debate in the media, is all about the banking and financial crisis supporting the privileged. Very little on those who are disadvantaged. At the very start of your paper, Kathleen, and I like to be an optimist, I still am an optimist, but you did make the statement that this time of crisis can be a time of opportunity as well. I must say I don't think that is true somewhat, because over the last 10 years of the Celtic Tiger, when the tiger roared ahead and so on, it's particularly striking, by the way, that inequality has actually increased in this country. We are in the privileged position of being in the same company as the UK and the US in terms of being the most unequal societies in the world, yeah? Now, I'm going to finish because I'd like to go on talking about this the whole time and so on and so on. But how does one achieve change? Now, it's fine to say, Kathleen, that you can produce papers and papers and academic papers and so on and so on. But how do you influence the system? The political parties will all state that they are interested in reducing inequalities and so on. So will the body, the electorate and so on. But it's striking that when the electorate are asked in opinion polls after opinion polls, they do not favour increased taxation to provide better public services. Okay? Now, that's an appalling commentary on our society. So where is the mechanism? Where is the lever for change? And I believe the lever for change is not in parading out all these statistics and stuff, because you turn people off, but we've got to show to society why it's in their interests to have a more equal society.
I don't want to cut you off, but there are other people.
Yeah,
but I'd like to group the questions. Yeah. Maybe have 2 or 3 questions together for Kathleen.
I'm finished. Sorry.
Not so much a question, just a couple of comments. That I liked what you said there, Kathleen, about what was it, nomenclature. Don't let the nomenclature divide us. And I'm thinking here as here this evening who, the kind of people we are this evening, and the kind of people who wouldn't come, who didn't come to a gathering like this. And I'm thinking of the importance of somehow finding some kind of a common language. And there's a language of academia, a language of newspapers and journalism, etc., etc. And then there's a language on the street where people use their fists to make their own points. Excuse me. And I think of the human body and the fact that the human brain is embodied in the body, that the nerves go right through the body, down the spinal cord, and reach into every fingertip and every toe. And so we think of the brain as being in the skull, but I mean, dancers and martial artists will prove otherwise to us. So I think of the language of feeling that people on the street will have, and I think of the language of the head, which journalists and academics might have, and I think of the possibility of all of us meeting in some kind of a forum where we could begin to devise some kind of a common language.
Right, can we have, right at the back?
I think it does is, I think in fact equality is a language that actually is very familiar to Irish people. It's not an alien language. It's in the Constitution. It's in the UN Declaration on Human Rights. It's in the UN Covenant on Economic and Social Rights. It's in the Convention for Human Rights. It's not an alien language. It's not something people know at least basically what it means. And I think the reason I was so anxious about the move to fairness is because I know its origins. And I know how it's likely to be interpreted. And it can mean anything to anybody. And if you claim it, of course, who would disagree with unfairness? Nobody could. And that's probably why people use it. But it also means that, as I said there to you, it's interpreted by people power at their own convenience. So I think it is very dangerous. And to use it consistently is to fail to differentiate yourself from basic principles of justice. You have, maybe I'm not in politics, right? But I think to answer or come back to the question you asked at the beginning, the first question, people, of course, I was on the radio, I remember, before the last general election at a panel discussion, and nobody would talk about taxation, and I can see why. We have created a country that people believe they have no moral obligation to their neighbours and to civil society and to the state. We created that culture. It didn't happen by accident. And we can create a different culture. I'm not saying we will do it in 12 months. But people are, I basically believe that people are good. And most people, you talked about, I mean, there is a wealth of evidence, I didn't want to repeat it, but Wilson and Pickett book shows that equality is good for everybody, even for the better off. You know, amazing to most people that middle-class people in England have actually lower life expectancy and quality of life than working-class people in Finland. That is truly amazing. But it is true. So I think equality is a very good principle because it means if you translate it in that self-interested way, although there are dangers in doing that because, you know, people will only think of it that way. But it is true. For example, take another very fundamental thing we know from research. If you have more equal society, actually, you have less mental illness. That's very well known. And one of the things, like, people don't have the same sense of failure. There isn't as much to lose if you fall to the bottom. You are not cast out to the same degree. There is a net to hold you. There are many, many reports and statistics, etc., on the value of equality for creating a stable society. You have fewer people in prison because, of course, imprisonment, which costs, as we know, an enormous amount of money, in my view, is a huge waste of public money. It actually results from people who are, as you say, at the spine down their back, their resentment about the fact that they have no opportunity in a society where you're told every day, consume, 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 you're defined by consumption. But do people say, what is the politics of having enough? Has a party said, what would be a good life? What would be a good life for people to have? So I think if you want to create a new society and a new Ireland, then you have to have ideas, and equality is one of them, I'm not saying it's the only one, that shows to people that you have more political stability, you have better health overall, you just create more, because basically also you have less fighting for advantage.
There were a number of things you said that I was really delighted to hear you say. Number one is this gap between the knowledge that is produced in the social sciences in universities and the media use of that knowledge. It seems to me to be a particularity about Irish society. I don't find it in other societies, why the media seems so adverse to even reading and knowing about the critical social science output from our universities. The second point you made about the lack of funding for this research is, of course, a very urgent point. I was delighted to hear you say it. My question, however, is about the political economy dimension, which lingered at the background of your talk. And I suppose, to be provocative, my real question is whether you feel the very demanding equality of condition that you quite rightly put forward, and I think you've made a huge contribution to our knowledge in Irish society by distinguishing different forms of equality so clearly in your work and your colleagues' work. My question is whether you think that's possible in a capitalist society. And I suppose to tease out a little bit more, it struck me that in some comments you made about social democracy, you seemed to be equating social democracy to a liberal society. You didn't seem to make very clear distinctions. My view would be that the societies in the real world which have been most successful at creating some real equality of condition, though not an equality of condition that seems to me to arrive at the very demanding level that you quite rightly, I think, outlined, have been social democratic societies. So my question is, do you think it's possible within a capitalist society? If it's not, what sort of society do we require to achieve these goals?
A few very quick points. One would be, I think that this confusion around fairness is informed by what I would call the economy of sameness. I think that so many people believe that because we're all the same, we're all human, well then we should be all treated the same. And I think that equality will never be realized unless we educate us, all of us, to a deep appreciation that we will only have equality when we have respect for diversity and difference. And of that I am convinced. And there is very little deep respect for diversity and difference because of this preoccupation for an economy of sameness. The other thing I might say, which might answer Sean's concern at the beginning, I do feel that our media does presume that people will turn off if we just offer critique. And I think it behoves us, those of us that kind of stand on the more radical edge of a society, that as we offer robust critique, which we absolutely must in this society, that is silencing critique, I think whenever we can couple our critique with our imagination, and also call for people to stand in solidarity around the new image of the possible. Because too often people who radically critique find themselves standing on their own or in communities of deep vulnerability. And so those with power can very, very quickly pull the plug on that voice.
I just wonder, is there an element we miss in this kind of debate, and that's the extent to which the sort of political party and candidate values are dictated by the values of those who actually turn out to vote. And you'll find that among, I think there's quite an amount of research that shows that people, say particularly who live in disadvantaged areas, have, number one, very low voter registration rates, and number two, very low turnout rates when it comes to elections. And I suspect that if you looked at the groups, the 9 groups that are covered by the equality legislation, that you'd probably find in quite a number of those groups you'd have something similar as well. And I very rarely hear that mentioned in any discussion of equality.
Wilkinson and Pickett's book, The Spirit Level, you see it there. And the reason, of course, is after the war, as you probably know, it constrained and limited the wealth, the income differentials to about 5 to 1. You couldn't, nobody in the head of a corporation could earn more than 5 times what somebody at the bottom earned. Now, there was outsourcing of labour and everything else, which created problems. That's another issue subsequently. But that remains. If you look at Japan, in economic terms, has actually got a very equal distribution of wealth. So, and it also has the highest life expectancy for women and for men in the world. So I think we need to be careful and not to be like European and Eurocentric in our definition of what constitutes the good society. So yes, I suppose if you're a powerful economy, if we're willing to do it, we can certainly regulate capitalism. And that's what they probably have done in Northern Europe. I presume that's what you're referring to. They have regulated capitalism. But I think you won't, the tendency, I mean, it's so obvious. I mean, I read the business sections of the newspaper all the time to keep myself informed. But the bottom line is the share price index. That's what it is. That's the bottom line. So I don't think you can get away from that fact. Maybe if there's a global move, you know, international regulation now, financial capital, there will be a change. But that is the challenge. So I hope that answers your question. You asked me something about social democracy. I find it interesting, of course, they are called social democratic states, but there is a lot of socialist thinking within those states and very strong feminist thinking, and I would like to draw attention to that. Nobody ever talks about the fact that one of the reasons maybe that those countries are much more equal in terms of their life expectancy, health and well-being, is that they have on average 40% of women in their parliaments. And one of the points I make in the paper is not because women are biologically better than men. In fact, women would want power just as men and would be just as corruptible. But I think the difference is at this moment in history, women tend to live closer to the vulnerable in society. And whoever lives closest to the vulnerable is more aware of the vulnerabilities. Health, education, social welfare, housing become priorities. I firmly believe that it's the person who wears the shoe knows where it hurts. I have never believed that somebody can go and speak in your name, claim to speak in your behalf, and speak the same way as you do. I do not believe that. I have argued in the paper, for example, is that we should have a new concept of constituency. I do not see why we have to have 42 regional constituencies. Regionality is only one criterion. What's a region? We have high mobility, people with mass communication, we can move around the country, we have mobile phones. Why are regions sacred in terms of political constituencies? Could disabled people be a political constituency? Could women be a political constituency? Why not? We have just as much entitlement to it as anyone else. So I think we need to rethink the boundaries of politics and the boundaries of how we reconstitute politics. The other question was about the economy of sameness, and I think you're right. I mean, I think that maybe there isn't respect for diversity. I think there's more respect for diversity than there is concern for economic justice. I'd say it has grown that little bit more. I don't think economic justice, as somebody has pointed out, has grown at all. The move to people, I think, to me, symbolically, it's the what you call those gates, the electronic gates. The electronic gates symbolise, to me, the New Ireland. People can't get at you if they're poor. They don't know how to ring the bell. Sometimes there is no bell. They can't, you can lock yourself away. And we have come to live in our comfort zones. And I think for the crisis, you say maybe it's not an opportunity. Well, I think it is, because it has disrupted the assumption that professionals like myself have an entitlement to earn a lot more than other people. We haven't an entitlement. We have absolutely no entitlement to it whatsoever. And so I think in that sense, I think that there is a possibility of change, but we have to provide the ideas and we haven't to be afraid. We can't be afraid. I think, if we are afraid, nothing will ever happen.
Now, there's right at this side for the next three.
Nora
okay.
Owen is my name, and I've spent many years in politics.
Didn't recognise you, Nora. My apologies.
Many years in politics, and now I'm on the outside. I can see just an anecdote about electronic gates. They are causing, I think, even more disaffection between politics and the people, because when you go canvassing now, you very often have to do your canvass through an electronic speaker, because people don't come down to the door anymore, to the gate. So, I mean, and that's bad, because at least when there's an election on, politicians might get a chance to confront some of the things that people are suffering behind the electronic gates or behind the closed doors. So that's a very serious problem, and I think we have to watch that doesn't happen. I just wanted to say, Kathleen, that language and the use of words, there is no doubt in my mind that very few women now will say they are feminists. The word has lost something, and if you say it in certain groups, particularly where there's more men in the group than women, and even where there are women, they'll immediately throw their hands up, oh, not that old stuff again. I mean, I'm being frank about it, and inside the political system, if you use words like feminism to your colleagues, I'm sorry to say, but you lose them. So you have to find some other language to talk to them about the difficulties that are in society. And I want to ask you, Kathleen, why is it that since we joined the EEC, as it was in the 70s and onwards, we have introduced in this country very big portfolio of legislation that should be bringing more equality into our society. All through the 70s and into the 80s and 90s, labour law and that. But somehow there's a mismatch, and I'm wondering, what is it that we can do? Is the political discourse, should we, when a new piece of legislation is introduced that is giving more rights to people and trying to make society more, should we maybe have a year later another big debate as to how it's being implemented and how it is actually delivering and working? I just wonder, have you given any thought to that? Thank you.
Thank you. There was somebody behind you, was the number 2, and the number 3 was also on this side, a little bit further up. And then
I'm a Labour councillor. I see one of my colleagues eyeing me over here. But I just wanted to say something about the part of the city that I represent. It's Finglas and Ballymund, the northwest area. And it just reminded me, when the words came out of Kathleen's mouth, I come from an area that has always been bashed around in the media for the wrong reasons, right? I was never involved in politics in my life. I was a community activist. I've tried to bring people together voluntarily with other groups of people in a certain part of the northwest area. When we tried to link in with the services there was very little money. This was in the pre-Celtic Tiger era, right? And here we are now in the situation we are, which we've very few resources that are cut to ribbons. And I don't want to politicalise this one way or the other. We all know what we're talking about. But the words that came out of your mouth regarding community development, empowering people, that's been all knocked on the head. And I know Deputy Owen was talking about intercoms when she's canvassing, she doesn't know who's who behind all that. I've never come across that in the northwest area. Okay? But I totally agree with you. Empowering people, we don't have the resources being put into these areas. And maybe it's a game that they're all playing. When I first got into the politics and I was elected, and a couple of doors here, next door to us is Mansion House. We had a great get-together, and one thing that I did say was, the first words out of me out, that the Labour Party have moved to the centre. They've gone away from the left. So I'm not going to change the Labour Party, but I'm coming from an area, and you mentioned it yourself, you have to be there, work there, live there, and experience it. Thank you very much.
Anne Colgan, Kathleen, I wondered for people who have an appetite for change, and that's a theme that's running through some of the conversation tonight. I'm inclined to think, and I've no evidence for this, that Irish people are concerned about inequality, but find it difficult to make the step from there to a commitment to equality. Is it possible that some concept of narrowing the gap or closing the gap might be a route to change that would bring the public along the journey to equality? And my second question is, do you have a view about what role, if any, the civil service or the public administration plays in the way concepts of equality get translated or not translated into public policy? Thank you.
I suppose people do that, but you know, so what, like, is my attitude if they object to the language. I think we have to reclaim it. I think there were a number of mistakes made maybe in the feminist movement. I can't see you, sorry, their camera's in the way at the moment. I think that what happened was, I don't think everybody thought that everything was won and women were fine, especially when Mary Robinson got elected. But really, if you look at political representation, and apart from what we've had to do from EU law, very little has changed. And one of the problems, I think, is what I adverted to, is the fact that we don't have a debate in liberal political thought, the private, and it is very profound in Ireland, influenced of course by Catholic social teaching, which is so influential historically, that a woman's place is in the home. And people, even like we've this study I referred to there on care and justice, a lot of people still believe that. They haven't got out of that frame, and part of the problem is that there isn't a debate either in the public sphere about how you remain domesticated by the lack of public childcare. You cannot do it. I mean, I see it every day of the week at work. People, especially in low income, we have a PhD student, brilliant young woman, 2 children on social welfare. How could she do her PhD? How could she get a job? She can't afford €1,000 in childcare. It's out of the question for 2 children. It would be more. And the fact that that question has never been seriously put, that is a big political issue. It isn't a trivial issue. It's a serious economic issue. Because A, it needs to be resourced, and B, very well qualified women in this country cannot work often to their capacity because they can't get childcare. So I think that the failure of, if you like, liberal politics and the equality agenda to actually interface the public and the private, to link the care sphere to the economic sphere, to link care to politics, has meant that we haven't had that debate at all. Because you can't participate without childcare. I always say you can get the childcare as a woman you can afford to pay for in Ireland. That's what you get. So I think that I think we need to reclaim feminism. I don't think I have, and I think that many women like myself were, if you like, would be seen to be quite conventional, if you like, in a sense that I don't have any big deal about men. They're fine if you get on with them. I have a mixed family and all the rest of it. The husband, children. But I think we need to reclaim it and not be afraid of it. And so what? It's only about equality. That's what feminism is. It's no more and no less than that. The other question was asked by, was it somebody from Finglas?
Oh, the
Jeff from Finglas,
yes.
Well, I think, I don't know whether you're making a statement or, I think we've seen in Britain.
Largely it was resource issues in these areas.
Well, I mean, I think community development programs, we know what's happening. That's what I was talking about. They have been cut because, in fact, they are producing dissent. That is it. They are educating people. They are doing constructive things. And also they are seen to be irrelevant. The people, I asked a very senior civil servant, somebody asked me, what I think, why was the cut proposed so heavily on a sector that was so evidently productive? And the answer I got was they were not politically powerful. And I think that is very depressing. But I also think there's another level at which a lot of community groups have been producing community activists. They haven't always toed the party line of those maybe who are in power. And I just wonder if that's not another reason. And I think there was a third question about the civil service.
Yes, indeed.
I don't know enough about the civil service to comment, but I have always been astounded when I've gone onto websites, the extent to which the language changed, for example. From customers, like, for example, to patients in hospitals. It is, if you're sick, you don't need a choice of hospital, you need a good hospital. You need one hospital. It is a right to be cared for when you're sick. It is a basic human right. So I think it's frightening to me the extent to which the civil service seems to have taken on the language of new managerialism and neoliberalism without any critique evident. It seems to me, without dissent. Maybe there was internally. I have actually done an analysis of a number of websites looking at how they name people in health and education, and I have been astounded. That's all I can say, but I don't know enough about it internally.
My name is Rita Fagan, and I'm a community activist in St. Mike's Estate, which one of the estates that was actually failed in terms of the regeneration. And I'm not going to stop saying that no matter where I go, because what happened to that community should never happen again to any others. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about the community development programme, because I really think it is right tonight, Kathleen, that you do, defend it a little bit. But what happens is that a lot of people don't really know what we do in those programmes. And what we do is local education, which gives roots to people into formal education and into jobs. What we do is we build people's voices to be able to challenge the conditions that they live in, because one sitting in this room would not understand the conditions, say, of Ballymun, of Myross, of Michaels or Devonley, of Dolphin House, of those communities that have been left behind in what you say. We build that voice and we build that leadership We also keep children in the schools. We keep children in primary school. We have after schools that works with those because the systems doesn't work for them. We keep individual families in terms of keeping their heads above water and from going into risk in terms of economic meltdown or whatever. And we keep, we work the system for the system itself because we allow people to be able to work that system and get their rights. We are innovative, we are proud of our work, and we do shout about the injustices because what we're about is social change and what we're about is defending the poor. And we can talk all about it, and at the moment we're marching the streets and we're doing everything we can to defend the very poor in this society, and the next chop is coming. And it's coming very fast, and as you said, it's coming to lone parents, and it's definitely coming to community and voluntary groups, and it's coming all over the place. And my question would be, as I say, equality isn't the starting point for the poor. The starting point for the poor is survival. And my question is, you know, how can we all who have okay lives get on the defence for those people, for those at the bottom of our society who didn't benefit, who the gap got much, much wider. But we need more than just words. We need actions, and we need them in all kinds of places. On the 30th of June, we have to sign off a merger between the CDPs and the partnership. It's a forced merger. It's not a merger, it's not something we want to do. We want to keep our local voice, our local autonomy and our resources, and we're being forced to sign that off. And we've been putting a lot of pressure on Pat Carey, and we need more pressure to be put on him and more questions to be asked from the other sectors of society. And I get called all kinds of names. Who I am is Rita, what I do is defend the poor. But there was something that Gilmore said on Al Crowley's launch of his book, Economy of Equality. What would it take for those in the civil service whose jobs it is to look after those sections? What would it take for them once to stand on the side of the people who's actually paying their wages?
The Association of Citizenship and Political Education. I would like to thank Kathleen for her paper. She mentioned about CSPE, and yes, it's a compulsory subject in post-primary schools up until the junior cert. However, they just have a taste of it, and then there's no follow-up. However, at the moment, there is a draft syllabus for social and political studies. Unfortunately, that does not have a philosophy element to it, and I'd be concerned that what we'd get is a description of politics rather than, in other words, we'd show the how of politics rather than the why. And I note particularly your emphasis on the fact that there's no ideology really in Ireland, and apart from the left, is sometimes mentioned in relating to the left. There's all those hidden ideologies within the parties. And I really think that that, for me, is what political education should be about. The other point you made, you mentioned the community development programmes. And I've heard Rita speaking before, especially on the Vincent Brown show, about community development. I'd just like to say, as a teacher, that I have seen the benefits of those programmes. And it is incredible. If you were doing a cost-benefit analysis, well then I think they really pay over the odds. Another point I'd like to make is that what you said about how you get these ideas out, you know, the idea that equality pays. That's what the book, The Spirit Level, shows. I think perhaps, that's why I'm very interested in TASC, because they have sort of research-based evidence. So in other words, it's researched. It's how to get that into the public domain and influence people. And I would suggest, you know, that the people from the Labour Party here maybe, you know, adopt some of the papers that TASC have put forward, and, you know, adopt the ideas that you have put forward this evening, because unequal societies, everyone pays for it, and it leads to a lot of unhappiness, the mental illness, all of that. And so I think the task for, I think most people who came to this tonight would recognise the huge inequalities in society, and the question for us all is, how is it going to be addressed? So finally, I have one question for you, Kathleen, and it's this. You mentioned managerialism and how it crept into education and health. I know nurses who are deeply offended that their patients and the people they care for are described as clients or customers. In education as well, in some websites for schools now, the students and their parents are described as customers. I just would like your view on this. I put this language of managerialism, which came in from the private sector into the public sector. I date it back to benchmarking. The theory with benchmarking was that there was going to be a brain drain from the top of the public service into the private sector. And they had to justify in some way getting increases like those in the private sector. They looked at different models like performance-related pay, benchmarking. And the result of that was actually, it was those at the very top who benefited most. In fact, they brought the feudal system into most sectors of the public sector. I'd just like to know your view on that, because that's where I would look at where the managerial model came into the public sector, because we were constantly being told we should do it really like the private sector and have bonuses and performance-rated pay. And there was a whole language around that. I would just be interested in your views on that. But thank you very much.
Stimulating presentation. My name is Jim Glennon. I'm a former member of the Oireachtas. You mentioned, Kathleen, in your response to some of the questions about a rethink of the boundaries of politics, and you weren't just talking about a redrawing of the constituency boundaries, as happens from time to time. Having been a member, like Nora, of the Oireachtas, although not quite for the length of service that Nora had, I came out of it very cynical about our political system, our parliamentary system particularly, and its relevance to modern Ireland, and particularly its relevance in terms of the so-called republic in which we live. To me, a republic is based on equality. And I think republic in the context of Ireland as we have it at present is a total misnomer. But if you take it, and I think it's only reasonable to assume that our legislators at present, because they are the product of that system, they have no great appetite for changing it. They have no great appetite even to examine the need for change. But yet, when you take a constitution that arrived in 1937, and you have a democratic parliamentary system which is based, if you think about it, right back to the tribunes of Rome, and you think also of the primary purpose of a parliamentary assembly, which is communication, and you think of the communication revolution that is ongoing at present, and how our parliamentary system hasn't maintained pace with modern communication. How are we going to deal with changing the political system? Because I would respectfully suggest that any change in the current attitude to equality from the people that matter won't come without massive change of the political system. Thank you.
Rita, your comment, I suppose the only thing I'd say is I think talking actually does matter. I think it does. It matters an awful lot. I mean, marching matters, talking matters, going to meetings matter. An awful lot of social change is extremely boring. I said to somebody, the young people the other day, they wanted to know when the revolution was coming. Well, I said, it's very slow, it's very long, and it's continuous. And an awful lot of it involves the most tedious work. So I think that, yes, I think that, there are modes of resistance. And I think that many ways of bringing about change are very, very difficult. They're often serving the most boring committees and making sure that certain things are passed and are not passed. I mean, that's actually the coalface of it a lot of the time. And in fact, there's a concept in social science called Categorical Injustice. And it's a book called On the Notion. And I think it's a very important concept because it points out that A lot of injustice is not about individual dispositions or attitudes. It's where something gets embedded, like the last speaker spoke about, as a way of modes of representation within the state, and it then becomes impossible to change. And I always say I'd learned a lot from Margaret Thatcher. I said this while we were meeting beforehand. The genius of her was not just to bring, her right-wing, what was pro-monetarist, pro-capitalist policies in. She institutionalized injustice within the British state and broke the infrastructure of the welfare state. So I think there is a lesson for that for those who want to bring about change. You have to institutionalize new systems, and I don't think it's easy. Believe me, I'm working UCD for 20 years trying to establish equality studies in the social justice. We have had holy war, and that's all I could describe it, sometimes very unholy war. So I know plenty about bringing about, even within a big organization and small in national and international terms. So I'm not saying that I think community development, as the other speaker said, cost-benefit analysis, it is the stupidest thing to cut those programs than is imaginable. It is so politically and economically stupid. That's all I can say. The other comment I think was made, I'm just trying to think, somebody asked me about the new managerialism. I don't think there is a lot written internationally on new managerialism and the rise of neoliberal politics. It is not exclusive to Ireland. It is particularly, I don't want to give you a short-potted history of it, but it is important to remember that it was systematic, it was organised, and it began particularly in the Chicago School of Economics, later in the Chicago Faculty of Law, in the 1970s, after the early 70s, the oil crisis. It was exported to Chile. If somebody knows the history of what happened in Chile. And there is a now very well-known book in France called The New Spirit of Capitalism, published in French originally, now published in English, which shows how it was transposed and transported into French and European political culture. There were think tanks, right-wing think tanks, and in fact they stopped doing research. They actually just produced ideology. They produced slogans. To come back to what somebody said, I don't believe we can lead life by slogan, but that is what they did. And of course they had massive money behind them. So I don't think it came with just benchmarking. I think benchmarking may have had an impact, but it's ubiquitous, especially the so-called fall of communism in Europe post-1990. Capitalism won the Cold War. That's the bottom line. Capitalism ruled the world until the financial crisis, certainly, and maybe still. But certainly it is, I don't think, empirically accurate to say that that caused it. It contributed to it. And I think it fell on, what shall I say, it fell on fertile ground in Irish intellectual life where there was no debate. And I go back to talk about it. There is no money to do research on anything. There's a handful of us who write about those things. We all nearly know one another. There are so few. So I think that was the cause. I don't think it was solely the other factor. I'm not in politics, but I do actually, unlike a lot of people, I have a great admiration for people in politics. I think it is a really tough life. But I know, why would anybody want to change if you're elected and have a new political system? They haven't, I'm sure, an absolute notion. And in that sense, we do need a revolution. And it doesn't have to be violent, but we do need one. I do think it's outrageous, for example, that we've only 13.9% of women in the parliament. I think it's outrageous that we've no representation from other groups. Like, we've no working class people. We've just done analysis of it. There's nobody from those backgrounds. We've no people who really are there to represent an enormous group in Ireland who are disabled people. There are huge sectors of Irish society that are completely unrepresented or misrepresented. So yes, but I don't think, calling for it, but I still think it is important to say it, even if no one heeds it. If we go on saying it, the time may come.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Kathleen, for the lecture. Very interesting and informative as usual. Just one point on the equality in relation to equal pay and your view on the benefit of legislation to enforce equality rights or equal pay rights. on one hand, which I think this legislation badly needs to be overhauled, because men are now being treated unequal or less equal the same way as women, because the legislation is gender-based. There's still the gap of 18% between them due to the gender clause within that legislation, because effectively both men and women now are being low paid, so you can't make any progress under that legislation. And the other thing is the elimination of the Equality Authority, the only kind of body that we had to take cases to it, and now there's about a 2.5 year waiting list, which by the time you make a claim, everybody forgets what the claim was and gets fed up and forgets about it.
Thank you.
Stand up for you. My name is John Bissett. I'm a community worker up around the same area as Rita. I want to say a lot of things, but maybe the simple point that I really want to make is this idea that it will be power over equality, and at the moment that's what seems to me to be winning out in relation to the trade union movement and the political parties, that they will put power ahead of the equality agenda. And I think that we have to find ways to shift that. I think it's happened with the Croke Park deal in relation to people's working conditions and hours, in terms of maybe short-term gains as it's been seen, and in relation to the possibility of a general election within the next 12 to 18 months or 2 years. It doesn't seem that any of the parties will endorse that for fear of losing power potentially. Like I've worked for a long time in Rialto and Inchicore in that context, and there are a lot of people working on the ground, but that issue of making a decisive break and of the adoption of an equality of condition agenda, I know it's not easy, it's difficult, but there's not a sense of that. Like all of the recent actions of the major institutional players have said that they don't really want that. There's a bit of doublespeak going on in terms of that the sloganeering for it, but the substantial aspects of it and a real foundational sense that actually we're going to take the risk for a society based on equality of condition. And we know that potentially we may lose on that, but actually we're really going to go for it. There are lots of political people in this room tonight. I have absolutely no sense in the political mainstream that they are prepared to take that risk, or in the trade union movement.
Just on the question of equal play, I mean, I'm unusual in that I actually don't believe, I suppose, in big income differentials at all. In fact, I believe that one should be rewarded very little for being more like an academic as opposed to a cleaner. I think maybe it's debatable that you should even earn that much more. Why should you? It's a very privileged life. It's a very easy life. If you're working on a building site and dirt going into your eyes, I often watch the people with pneumatic drills. There's a lot of hard work in life. So in that sense, for me, this is like taking the doxa, the hidden kind of, the absolute kind of sacred cow of trade union, all negotiations about pay, and saying it's problematic. It is problematic, actually. It's very problematic. Because I don't want to live in a country, if I can speak personally, in which the person next door to me or down the road from me is terrified their child will be the person who ends up in the job with no security, with hours, with dirty working conditions, with, people trying to, and everyone, a lot of the time, I think middle class people like myself, we forget that those are the options for a lot of people. And I'm saying, I don't want to live in that country. I don't think we need to live in that country. And I know that there have been gains, and the minimum wage was important, and it still is very important, and it was an important gain. But I think we have also to look at the other end of the spectrum, not just in terms of income, but in terms of wealth. We don't have a significant tax on wealth in this country. We have all, I have gone on, and I will go on, about the 12.5% corporation profit tax, because I have been examining corporation profit all over Europe, and we are not remotely in the same league of any country. Germany is 37.5% if you add the federal and the state tax. So there are a lot of issues that we need to address, and I know it's another sacred cow. So when you talk to me about wages, that to me is the big issue. Why should we have a flatter structure? Should we have a maximum? And should we also have very punitive taxes on unearned wealth, like reducing the capital gains tax from 40 to, well, it's now 25%, in my view, was criminal. because it meant that poor people on low wages and on social welfare were going to have to pay indirect taxes often when they went to the hospital, which are grossly unjust and unfair and not at all progressive. So I'm afraid that is my answer. But have you asked about the Equality Authority? I think it's a disaster, the cutting of the funds of the Equality Authority. And again, it's an attack on the view of equality, that even, you know, not resourcing it, and it means that it was able to take cases. Now there's no one to take cases. Yesterday somebody rang me up to know would I know somebody, because they felt they would have to go to the courts, but they couldn't afford to go to the Circuit Court and then with an appeal to the High Court. So I think that is a major issue. The last question you asked was about fear of losing power. Well, it's easy to talk when you're not the person, but I really do wish that Labour and Left and whoever else there is, and there are left-wing egalitarians in many parties, I really wish they would get together and give a new message. People are weary in many areas of life. From rural Ireland, they are absolutely, totally disillusioned with politics. Totally and utterly disillusioned. It is a time to give a new language and to show the commitment that you actually believe in it.